Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton, and this is Pepper, and today we are going to be continuing our reading of Mary Poppins Comes Back by P. L. Travers. Let's dive right in to Chapter 9, Nellie Rubina. I don't believe it will ever stop. Ever. Jane put down her copy of Robinson Crusoe and gazed gloomily out of the window. The snow fell steadily, drifting down in large, soft flakes, covering the park and the pavements and the houses in Cherry Tree Lane with its thick, white mantle. It had not stopped snowing for a week, and in all that time the children had not once been able to go out. I don't mind, not very much, said Michael from the floor, where he was busy arranging the animals of his Noah's Ark. We can be Eskimos and eat whales. Silly. How could we get whales when it's too snowy even to go and buy cough drops? They might come here. Whales do sometimes, he retorted. How do you know? Well, I don't know exactly, but they might. Jane, where's the second giraffe? Oh, here he is, under the tiger. He put the two giraffes into the ark together. The animals went in 2 by 2, the elephant and the kangaroo, sang Michael. And because he hadn't got a kangaroo, he sent an antelope in with the elephant, and Mr. and Mrs. Noah behind them, to keep order. I wonder why they never have any relatives, he remarked presently. Who don't? Said Jane crossly, for she didn't want to be disturbed. The Noahs. I've never seen them with a daughter or a son or an uncle or an aunt. Why? Because they don't have them, said Jane. Do be quiet. Well, I was only remarking. Can't I remark if I want to? He was beginning to feel cross now, and very tired of being cooped up in the nursery. He scrambled to his feet and swaggered over to Jane. I only said, he began annoyingly, jogging the hand that held the book. But at that, Jane's patience gave way, and she hurled Robinson Crusoe across the room. How dare you disturb me? She shouted, turning on Michael. How dare you not let me make a remark? I didn't. You did. And in another moment, Jane was shaking Michael furiously by the shoulders, and he had gripped a great handful of her hair. What is all this? Mary Poppins stood in the doorway, glowering down at them. They fell apart. She shook me, wailed Michael, but he looked guiltily at Mary Poppins. He pulled my hair, sobbed Jane, hiding her head in her arms, for she dared not face that stern gaze. Mary Poppins stalked into the room. She had a pile of coats, caps, and mufflers on her arm, and the twins, round-eyed and interested, were at her heels. I would rather, she remarked with a sniff, have a family of cannibals to look after. They'd be more human. But she did shake me, Michael began again. Telltale tit, your tongue shall be slit, jeered Mary Poppins. Then, as he seemed to be going to protest, don't answer back, she said, warningly, and tossed him his overcoat. Get your things on, please. We're going out. Out? They could hardly believe their ears, but at the sound of that word all their crossness melted away. Michael, buttoning up his leggings, felt sorry he had annoyed Jane, and looked across to find her putting on her woolen cap and smiling at him. Hooray, 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 they shouted, stamping and clapping their woolen-gloved hands. Cannibals, she said fiercely, and pushed them in front of her down the stairs. The snow was no longer falling, but was piled in heavy drifts all over the garden and beyond. In the park, it lay over everything, like a thick white quilt. The naked branches of the cherry trees were covered with a glistening rind of snow, and the park railings, that had once been green and slender, were now white and rather woolly. Down the garden path, Robertson A. was languidly trailing his shovel, pausing every few inches to take a long rest. He was wearing an old overcoat of Mr. Banks's that was much too big for him. As soon as he had shovelled the snow from one piece of path, the coat, drifting behind him, swept a new drift of snow over the cleared path. But the children raced past him and down to the gate, crying and shouting and waving their arms. Outside in the lane, everybody who lived in it seemed to be taking the air. Ahoy there, shipmates! Cried a roaring, soaring voice as Admiral Boom came up and shook them all by the hand. He was wrapped from head to foot in a large Inverness cape, and his nose was redder than they had ever seen it. Good day, said Jane and Michael politely. Port and starboard, cried the Admiral. I don't call this a good day. Harumph. A hideous, hoary, landlubbery sort of a day, I call it. Why doesn't the spring come? Tell me that. Now, Andrew. Now, Willoughby. Keep close to Mother. Miss Lark, muffled up in a long fur coat and wearing a fur hat like a tea cosy, was taking a walk with her two dogs. Good morning, everybody, she greeted them fussily. What weather! Where has the sun gone? And why doesn't the spring come? Don't ask me, ma'am, shouted Admiral Boom. No affair of mine. You should go to sea. Always good weather there. Go to sea. Oh, Admiral Boom, I couldn't do that. I haven't the time. I'm just off to buy Andrew and Willoughby a fur coat each. A look of shame and horror passed between the two dogs. Fur coats, roared the Admiral. Blast my barnacle. Fur coats for a couple of mongrels. Heave her over, I say. Port, I say. Up with the anchor. Fur coats. Admiral, Admiral, cried Miss Lark, stopping her ears with her hands. Such language, please. Please remember, I am not used to it. And my dogs are not mongrels, not at all. One has a long pedigree, and the other has, at least, a kind heart. Mongrels, indeed. And she hurried away, talking to herself in a high, angry voice, with Andrew and Willoughby sidling behind her, swinging their tails and looking very uncomfortable and ashamed. The ice cream man trundled past on his cycle, going at a terrific rate and ringing his bell madly. "Don't stop me, or I shall catch cold," said the notice in front of his cart. "Whenever's that there spring comin'?" shouted the ice cream man to the sweep, who at that moment came trudging round the corner. To keep out the cold, he had completely covered himself with brushes, so that he looked more like a porcupine than a man. "Brum, brum, bumble," came the voice of the sweep through the brushes. "What's that?" said the ice cream man. "Bumble," the sweep remarked, disappearing in at Miss Lark's tradesman's entrance. In the gateway to the park stood the keeper, waving his arms and stamping his feet and blowing on his hands. "Need a bit of spring, don't we?" he said cheerfully to Mary Poppins as she and the children passed through. "I'm quite satisfied," replied Mary Poppins primly, tossing her head. "Self-satisfied, I'd call it," muttered the keeper. But, as he said it behind his hand, only Jane and Michael heard him. Michael dawdled behind. He stooped and gathered up a handful of snow and rolled it between his palms. "Jane, dear," he called in a wheedling voice, "I've got something for you." She turned, and the snowball, whizzing through the air, caught her on the shoulder. With a squeal, she began to burrow in the snow, and presently there were snowballs flying through the air in every direction. And in and out among the tossing, glistening balls walked Mary Poppins, very prim and neat, and thinking to herself how handsome she looked in her large woolen gloves and her rabbit-skin coat. And just as she was thinking that, a large snowball grazed past the brim of her hat and landed right on her nose. "Huh!" screamed Michael, putting up both hands to his mouth. "I didn't mean to, Mary Poppins. I really didn't. It was for Jane." Mary Poppins turned, and her face, as it appeared through the fringe of broken snowball, was terrible. "Mary Poppins," he said earnestly, "I'm sorry. It was an accident." "An accident or not," she retorted, "that's the end of your snowballing. N'accident indeed. A Zulu would have better manners." She plucked the remains of the snowball from her neck and rolled them into a small ball between her woolen palms. Then she flung the ball right across the snowy lawn and went stamping haughtily after it. "Now you've done it," whispered Jane. "I didn't mean to," Michael whispered back. "I know, but you know what she is." Mary Poppins, arriving at the place where the snowball had fallen, picked it up and threw it again, a long, powerful throw. "Where is she going?" said Michael suddenly, for the snowball was bowling away under the trees, and instead of keeping to the path, Mary Poppins was hurrying after it. Every now and then she dodged a little fall of snow as it tumbled softly from a branch. "I can hardly keep up," said Michael, stumbling over his own feet. Mary Poppins quickened her steps. The children panted behind her, and when at last they caught up with the snowball, they found it lying beside the strangest building they had ever seen. "I don't remember seeing this house before," exclaimed Jane, her eyes wide with surprise. "It's more like an ark than a house," said Michael, staring. house stood, solidly in the snow, moored by a thick rope to the trunk of a tree. Round it, like a veranda, ran a long, narrow deck, and its highest peaked roof was painted bright scarlet. But the most curious thing about it was that though it had several windows, there was not a single door. "Where are we?" said Jane, full of curiosity and excitement. Mary Poppins made no reply. She led the way along the deck and stopped in front of a notice that said, "Knock 3.5 times." "What's half a knock?" whispered Michael to Jane. "Shh," she said, nodding towards Mary Poppins, and her nod said, as clearly as if she had spoken, "We are on the brink of an adventure. Don't spoil it by asking questions." Mary Poppins, seizing the knocker that hung above the notice, swung it upward and knocked 3 times against the wall. Then, taking it daintily between the finger and thumb of her woolen glove, she gave the merest, tiniest, smallest, gentlest tap, like this. Rap, rap, rap. Tap. Immediately, as though it had been listening and waiting for that signal, the roof of the building flew back on its hinges. "Goodness gracious!" Michael could not restrain the exclamation, for the wind of the roof, as it swung open, nearly lifted his hat off. Mary Poppins walked to the end of the narrow deck and began to climb a small, steep ladder. At the top she turned, and looking very solemn and important, beckoned with a woolly finger. "Step up, please." The 4 children hurried after her. "Jump!" cried Mary Poppins, leaping down from the top of the ladder into the house. She turned and caught the twins as they came tumbling over the edge with Jane and Michael after them. And as soon as they were all safely inside, the roof closed over again and shut with a little click. They gazed round them, 4 pairs of eyes popped with surprise. "What a funny room!" exclaimed Jane. But it was really more than funny. It was extraordinary. The only piece of furniture in it was a large counter that ran along one end of the room. The walls were whitewashed, and leaning against them were piles of wood cut into the shape of trees and branches, and all painted green. Small wooden sprays of leaves, newly painted and polished, were scattered about the floor, and several notices hung from the walls, saying, "Mind the paint," or "Don't touch," or "Keep off the grass." But this was not all. In one corner stood a flock of wooden sheep, with the dye still wet on their fleeces. Crowded in another were small, stiff groups of flowers, yellow aconites, green and white snowdrops, and bright blue scillas. All of them looked very shiny and sticky, as though they had been newly varnished. So did the wooden birds and butterflies that were neatly piled in a third corner. So did the flat white wooden clouds that leant against the counter. But the enormous jar that stood on a shelf at the end of the room was not painted. It was made of green glass and filled to the brim with hundreds of small, flat shapes of every kind and colour. "You're quite right, Jane," said Michael, staring. "It is a funny room." "Funny?" said Mary Poppins, looking as though he had said something insulting. "Well, peculiar?" "Peculiar!" Michael hesitated. He could not find the right word. "What I meant was, I think it's a lovely room, Mary Poppins," said Jane, hastily coming to his rescue. "Yes, it is," said Michael, very relieved. "And," he added cleverly, "I think you look very nice in that hat." He watched her carefully. Yes, her face was a little softer. There were even faint beginnings of a conceited smile around her mouth. She remarked, and turned towards the end of the room. "Nellie, Rubina," she called, "where are you? We've arrived." "Coming, coming." The highest, thinnest voice that they had ever heard seemed to rise up from beneath the counter. And presently, from the same direction as the voice, a head, topped with a small flat hat, popped up. It was followed by a round, rather solid body that held in one hand a pot of red paint and in the other a plain wooden tulip. Surely, thought Jane and Michael, this was the strangest person they had ever seen. From her face and size she seemed to be quite young, but somehow she looked as though she were made not of flesh, but of wood. Her stiff, shiny black hair seemed to have been carved on her head and then painted. Her eyes were like small black holes drilled in her face, and surely that bright pink patch on her shiny cheek was paint. "Well, Miss Poppins," said this curious person, her red lips glistening as she smiled, "this is nice of you, I must say." And putting down the paint and the tulip, she came round the counter and shook hands with Mary Poppins. Then it was that the children noticed she had no legs at all. She was quite solid from the waist downwards, and moved with a rolling motion by means of a round, flat disc that was where her feet should have been. "Not at all, Nellie Rubina," said Mary Poppins with unusual politeness. "It is a pleasure and a treat." "We've been expecting you, of course," Nellie Rubina went on, "because we wanted you to help with the—" She broke off, for not only had Mary Poppins flashed her a warning look, but she had caught sight of the children. "Ooh!" she cried, in her high, friendly voice. "You've brought Jane and Michael. Oh, and the twins, too. What a surprise!" She bowled across and shook hands jerkily with them all. "Do you know us, then?" said Michael, staring at her, amazed. "Oh, dear me, yes," she trilled gaily. "I've often heard my father and mother speak of you. Pleased to make your acquaintance." She laughed, and insisted on shaking hands all round again. "I thought, Nellie Rubina," said Mary Poppins, "that maybe you could spare an ounce of conversations." "Oh, most certainly," said Nellie Rubina, smiling and rolling towards the counter. "To do anything for you, Miss Poppins, is an honour and a joy." "But can you have conversation by the ounce?" said Jane. Yes, indeed. By the pound, too. Or the ton, if you like. Nellie Rubina broke off. She lifted her arms to the large jar on the shelf. They were just too short to reach it. Not long enough. I must have a bit added. In the meantime, I'll get my uncle to lift them down. Uncle Dodger! Uncle Dodger! She screamed the last words through a door behind the counter, and immediately an odd-looking person appeared. He was as round as Nellie Rubina, but much older and with a sadder sort of face. He, too, had a little flat hat on his head, and his coat was tightly buttoned across a chest as woodeny as Nellie Rubina's. And Jane and Michael could see, as his apron swung aside for a moment, that, like his niece, he was solid from the waist downwards. In his hand he carried a wooden cuckoo, half covered with grey paint, and there were splashes of the same paint on his own nose. You called, my dear? He asked, in a mild, respectful voice. And then he saw Mary Poppins. Ah, here you are at last, Miss Poppins. Nellie Rubina will be pleased. She's been expecting you to help us with... He caught sight of the children and broke off suddenly. Oh, I beg pardon. I didn't know there was company, my dear. I'll just go and finish this bird. You will not, Uncle Dodger, said Nellie Rubina sharply. I want the conversations lifted down. Will you be so good? Although she had such a jolly, cheerful face, the children noticed that when she spoke to her uncle, she gave orders rather than asked favours. Uncle Dodger sprang forward as swiftly as anybody could who had no legs. Certainly, my dear, certainly. He lifted his arms jerkily and set the jar on the counter. In front of me, please, ordered Nellie Rubina haughtily. Fussily, Uncle Dodger edged the jar along. There you are, my dear, begging your pardon. Are those the conversations? Asked Jane, pointing to the jar. They look more like sweets. So they are, miss. They're conversation sweets, said Uncle Dodger, dusting the jar with his apron. Does one eat them? Inquired Michael. Uncle Dodger, glancing cautiously at Nellie Rubina, leaned across the counter. One does, he whispered behind his hand, but I don't, being only an uncle by marriage. But she... He nodded respectfully towards his niece. She's the eldest daughter, and a direct descendant. Neither Jane nor Michael knew in the least what he meant, but they nodded politely. Now, cried Nellie Rubina gaily, as she unscrewed the lid of the jar, who'll choose first? Jane thrust in her hand and brought out a flat, star-shaped sweet, rather like a peppermint. There's writing on it, she exclaimed. Nellie Rubina shrieked with laughter. Of course there is. It's a conversation. Read it. You're my fancy, read Jane aloud. Ah, how very nice, tinkled Nellie Rubina, pushing the jar towards Michael. He drew out a pink sweet, shaped like a shell. I love you. Do you love me? He spelled out. Oh, that's a good one. Yes, I do. Nellie Rubina laughed loudly and gave him a quick kiss that left a sticky patch of paint on his cheek. John's yellow conversation read, Deedle Deedle Dumpling, and on Barbara's was written in large letters, Shining Bright and Airy. "And so you are," cried Nellie Rubina, smiling at her over the counter. "Now you, Miss Poppins." And as Nellie Rubina tipped the jar towards Mary Poppins, Jane and Michael noticed a curious, understanding look pass between them. Off came the large woolen glove, and Mary Poppins, shutting her eyes, put in her hand and scrabbled for a moment among the conversations. Then her fingers closed on a white one, shaped like a half-moon, and she held it out in front of her. 10 o'clock tonight, said Jane, reading the inscription aloud. Uncle Dodger rubbed his hands together. That's right, that's the time when we... Uncle Dodger! Cried Nellie Rubina in a warning voice. The smile died away from his face and left it sadder than before. "Begging your pardon, my dear," he said, humbly. "I'm an old man, I'm afraid, and I sometimes say the wrong thing. Beg pardon." He looked very ashamed of himself, but Jane and Michael could not see that he had done anything very wrong. "Well," said Mary Poppins, slipping her conversation carefully into her handbag, "if you'll excuse us, Nellie Rubina, I think we'd better be going." "Oh, must you?" Nellie Rubina rolled a little on her disc. "It has been such a satisfaction. Still," she glanced out of a window, "it might snow again and keep you imprisoned here. And you wouldn't like that, would you?" she trilled, turning to the children. "I would," said Michael stoutly. "I would love it. And then perhaps I'd find out what these are for." He pointed to the painted branches, the sheep and the birds and the flowers. "Those? Oh, those are just, decorations," said Nellie Rubina, airily dismissing them with a jerky wave of her hand. "But what do you do with them?" Uncle Dodger leaned eagerly across the counter. "Well, you see, we take them out and—" "Uncle Dodger!" Nellie Rubina's eyes were dark and snapping dangerously. "Oh, dear, there I go again, always speaking out of turn. I'm too old, that's what it is," said Uncle Dodger mournfully. Nellie Rubina gave him an angry look. Then she turned, smiling, to the children. "Goodbye," she said, jerkily shaking hands. "I'll remember our conversations. You're my fancy. I love you. Deedle-dee and Shining Bright." "You've forgotten Mary Poppins's conversation. It's 10 o'clock tonight," Michael reminded her. But she won't," said Uncle Dodger, smiling happily. "Uncle Dodger! Oh, begging your pardon. "Goodbye," said Mary Poppins. She patted her handbag importantly, and another strange look passed between her and Nellie Rubina. "Goodbye, goodbye." When Jane and Michael thought about it afterwards, they could not remember how they had got out of that curious room. One moment they were inside it, saying goodbye to Nellie Rubina, and the next they were out in the snow again, licking their conversations and hurrying after Mary Poppins. "Do you know, Michael," said Jane, "I believe that sweet was a message." "Which one? Mine?" "No, the one Mary Poppins chose." "You mean—" "I think something is going to happen at 10 o'clock tonight, and I'm going to stay awake and see." Then so will I, said Michael. Come along, please. Keep up, said Mary Poppins. I haven't all day to waste. Jane was dreaming deeply, and in her dream somebody was calling her name in a small, urgent voice. She sat up with a start to find Michael standing beside her in his pyjamas. You said you'd stay awake, he whispered accusingly. What? Where? Why? Oh, it's you, Michael. Well, you said you would, too. Listen, he said. There was a sound of somebody tiptoeing in the next room. Jane drew in her breath sharply. Quick, get back into bed. Pretend to be asleep. Hurry. With a bound, Michael was under the blankets. In the darkness, he and Jane held their breath, listening. From the other nursery, the door opened stealthily. The thin gap of light widened and grew larger. A head came round the edge and peered into the room. Then somebody slipped through and silently shut the door behind her. Mary Poppins, wrapped in her fur coat and holding her shoes in her hands, tiptoed through their room. They lay still, listening to her steps hurrying down the stairs. Far away, the key of the front door scraped in its lock. There was a scurry of steps on the garden path, and the front grate clicked. And at that moment, the clock struck 10. Out of bed they sprang and rushed into the other nursery where the windows opened on the park. The night was black and splendid, lit with high, swinging stars. But tonight, it was not stars they were looking for. If Mary Poppins's conversation had really been a message, there was something more interesting to be seen. Look! Jane gave a little gulp of excitement and pointed. Over in the park, just by the entrance gate, stood the curious arc-shaped building, loosely moored to a tree trunk. But how did it get there? Said Michael, staring. It was at the other side of the park this morning. Jane did not reply. She was too busy watching. The roof of the ark was open, and on the top of the ladder stood Nellie Rubina, balancing on her round disc. From inside, Uncle Dodger was handing up to her bundle after bundle of painted wooden branches. Ready, Miss Poppins? Tinkled Nellie Rubina, passing an armful down to Mary Poppins, who was standing on the deck, waiting to receive them. The air was so clear and still that Jane and Michael, crouched in the window seat, could hear every word. Suddenly there was a loud noise inside the ark as a wooden shape clattered to the floor. Uncle Dodger, be careful, please. They are fragile, said Nellie Rubina sternly. And Uncle Dodger, as he lifted out a pile of painted clouds, replied apologetically, Begging your pardon, my dear. The flock of wooden sheep came next, all very stiff and solid. And last of all, the birds, butterflies, and flowers. That's the lot, said Uncle Dodger, heaving himself up through the open roof. Under his arm, he carried the wooden cuckoo, now entirely covered with grey paint, and in his hand swung a large green paint pot. Very well, said Nellie Rubina. Now, if you're ready, Miss Poppins, we'll begin. And then began one of the strangest pieces of work Jane and Michael had ever seen. Never, never, they thought, would they forget it, even if they lived to be 90. From the pile of painted wood, Nellie, Rubina, and Mary Poppins each took a long spray of leaves, and leaping into the air, attached them swiftly to the naked, frosty branches of the trees. The sprays seemed to clip on easily, for it did not take more than a minute to attach them. And as each was slipped into place, Uncle Dodger would spring up and neatly dab a spot of green paint at the point where the spray joined the tree. "My goodness, goodness!" exclaimed Jane, as Nellie Rubina sailed lightly up to the top of a tall poplar and fixed a large branch there. But Michael was too astonished to say anything. All over the park went the three, jumping up to the tallest branch as if they were on springs. And in no time, every tree in the park was decked out with wooden sprays of leaves and neatly finished off with dabs of paint from Uncle Dodger's brush. Every now and then, Jane and Michael heard Nellie Rubina's shrill voice crying, "Uncle Dodger, be careful!" and Uncle Dodger's voice begging her pardon. And now, Nellie Rubina and Mary Poppins took up in their arms the flat, white, wooden clouds. With these they soared higher than ever before, shooting right above the trees and pressing the clouds carefully against the sky. "They're sticking! They're sticking!" cried Michael excitedly, dancing on the window seat. And sure enough, against the sparkling, darkling sky, the flat, white clouds stuck fast. "Woo!" cried Nellie Rubina as she swooped down. "Now for the sheep!" Very carefully, on a snowy strip of lawn, they set up the wooden flock, huddling the larger sheep together with the stiff white lambs among them. "We're getting on," Jane and Michael heard Mary Poppins say as she put the last lamb on its legs. "I don't know what we would have done without you, Mary Poppins. I really don't," said Nellie Rubina pleasantly. Then, in quite a different voice, "Flowers, please, Uncle Dodger, and look sharp." "Here, my dear." He rolled hurriedly up to her, his apron bulging with snowdrops, scillas, and aconites. And here we can see that very moment as Mary Poppins arranges the sheep down here, and Nellie Rubina clips the greenery to the trees, and Uncle Dodger hangs the clouds in the sky. Fantastic. "Oh, look, look!" Jane cried, hugging herself delightedly, for Nellie Rubina was sticking the wooden shapes round the edge of an empty flower bed. Round and round she rolled, planting her wooden border and reaching up her hand again and again for a fresh flower from Uncle Dodger's apron. "That's neat," said Mary Poppins admiringly, and Jane and Michael were astonished at the pleasant, friendly tone of her voice. "Yes, isn't it?" trilled Nellie Rubina, brushing the snow from her hands. "Quite a sight. What's left, Uncle Dodger?" "The birds, my dear, and the butterflies." He held out his apron. Nellie Rubina and Mary Poppins seized the remaining wooden shapes and ran swiftly about the park, setting the birds on branches or in nests and tossing the butterflies into the air. And the curious thing was that they stayed there, poised above the earth, their bright patches of paint showing clearly in the starlight. "There, I think that's all," said Nellie Rubina, standing still on her disc, with her hands on her hips as she gazed round at her handiwork. "One more thing, my dear," said Uncle Dodger. And rather unevenly, as though the evening's work had made him feel old and tired, he bowled towards the ash tree near the park gates. He took the cuckoo from under his arm and set it on a branch among the wooden leaves. "There, my bonny, there, my dove," he said, nodding his head at the bird. "Uncle Dodger, when will you learn? That's not a dove. It's a cuckoo." He bent his head humbly. "A dove of a cuckoo? That's what I meant. Begging your pardon, my dear." "Well now, Miss Poppins, I'm afraid we really must be going," said Nellie Rubina. And rolling towards Mary Poppins, she took the pink face between her two woodeny hands and kissed it. "See you soon, tra-la," she cried airily, bowling back along the deck of the ark and up the little ladder. At the top she turned and waved her hand jerkily to Mary Poppins. Then, with a woodeny clatter, she leapt down and disappeared inside. "Uncle Dodger, come along, don't keep me waiting," her thin voice floated back. "Coming, my dear, coming. Begging your pardon." Uncle Dodger rolled towards the deck, shaking hands with Mary Poppins on the way. The wooden cuckoo stared out from its leafy branch. He flung it a sad, affectionate glance. Then his flat disk rose in the air and echoed woodenly as he landed inside. The roof flew down and shut with a click. "Let her go!" came Nellie Rubina's shrill command from within. Mary Poppins stepped forward and unwound the mooring rope from the tree. It was immediately drawn in through one of the windows. "Make way there, please, make way!" shouted Nellie Rubina. Mary Poppins stepped back hurriedly. Michael clutched Jane's arm excitedly. "They're off!" he cried, as the ark rose from the ground and moved top-heavily above the snow. Up it went, rocking drunkenly between the trees. Then it steadied itself and passed lightly up and over the topmost boughs. A jerky arm waved downwards from one of the windows, but before Jane and Michael could be certain whether it was Nellie Rubina's or Uncle Dodger's, the ark swept into the starlit air, and a corner of the house hid it from view. Mary Poppins stood for a moment by the park gates, waving her woolen gloves. Then she came hurrying across the lane and up the garden path. The front door key scraped in the lock. A cautious footstep creaked on the stairs. "Back to bed, quick," said Jane. "She mustn't find us here." Down from the window seat and through the door they fled, and with 2 quick jumps landed in their beds. They had just time to put the bedclothes over their heads before Mary Poppins opened the door quietly and tiptoed through. Zup! That was her coat being hung on its hook. Crackle! That was her hat rustling down into its paper bag. But they heard no more. For by the time she had undressed and climbed into her camp bed, Jane and Michael had huddled down under the blankets and were fast asleep. Cuckoo, cuckoo, cuckoo. Across the lane, the soft bird note came floating. "Jumping giraffes!" cried Mr. Banks, as he lathered his face. "The spring is here!" And he flung down his shaving brush and rushed out into the garden. He gave one look at it, and then, flinging back his head, he made a trumpet with his hands. "Jane, Michael, John, Barbara," he called up to the nursery windows. "Come down. The snow's gone and spring has come. They came tumbling down the stairs and out of the front door to find the whole lane alive with people. "Ship ahoy!" roared Admiral Boom, waving his muffler. "Rope and rigging, cockles and shrimps, here's the spring." "Well," said Miss Lark, hurrying out through her gate, "a fine day at last. I was thinking of getting Andrew and Willoughby 2 pairs of leather boots each, but now the snow's gone, I shan't have to." At that, Andrew and Willoughby looked very relieved, and licked her hand to show they were glad she had not disgraced them. The ice cream man wheeled slowly up and down, keeping an eye open for customers, and today his notice board read, "Spring has come, rum-ti-tum, stop and buy one, spring has come." And the sweep, carrying only one brush, walked along the lane, looking from right to left with a satisfied air, as though he himself had arranged the lovely day. And in the middle of all the excitement, Jane and Michael stood still, staring about them. Everything shone and glistened in the sunlight. There was not a single flake of snow to be seen. From every branch of every tree, the tender pale green buds were bursting. Round the edge of the flower bed, just inside the park, fragile green shoots of aconites, snowdrops, and scillas were breaking into a border of yellow, white, and blue. Presently, the park keeper came along and picked a tiny bunch and put them carefully in his buttonhole. From flower to flower, brightly coloured butterflies were darting on downy wings, and in the branches, thrushes and tits and swallows and finches were singing and building nests. A flock of sheep with soft young lambs at their heels went by, baaing loudly. And from the bough of the ash tree by the park gates came the clear, double-noted call, "Cuckoo! Cuckoo!" Michael turned to Jane. His eyes were shining. "So that's what they were doing, Nellie, Rubina, and Uncle Dodger and Mary Poppins." Jane nodded, gazing wonderingly about her. Among the faint green smoke of buds, a grey body rocked backwards and forwards on the ash bough. "Cuckoo! Cuckoo!" "But I thought they were all made of painted wood," said Michael. "Did they come alive in the night, do you think?" "Perhaps," said Jane. "Cuckoo! Cuckoo!" Jane seized Michael's hand, and, as though he guessed the thought in her mind, he ran with her through the garden, across the lane, and into the park. "Aye, where are you going, you two?" called Mr. Banks. "Aye there, messmates," roared Admiral Boom. "You'll get lost," warned Miss Lark shrilly. The ice cream man tingled his bell wildly, and the sweep stood, staring after them. But Jane and Michael took no notice. They ran on, right through the park, under the trees, to the place where they had first seen the ark. They drew up, panting. It was cold and shadowy here, under the dark branches, and the snow had not yet melted. They peered about, seeking, but there was only a heavy drift of snowflakes spread under the dark green boughs. "It's really gone, then," said Michael, gazing round. "Do you think we only imagined it, Jane?" he asked doubtfully. She bent down suddenly and picked up something from the snow. "No," she said slowly. I'm sure we didn't. She held out her hand. In her palm lay a round, pink conversation suite. She read out the words, "Goodbye till next year. Nellie, Rubina, Noah." Michael drew a deep breath. So that's who she was. Uncle Dodger said she was the eldest daughter, but I never guessed. She brought the spring, said Jane dreamily, gazing at the conversation. I'll thank you, said a voice behind them, to come home at once and eat your breakfast, said Mary Poppins. They turned guiltily. We were just, Michael began to explain. Then don't, snapped Mary Poppins. She leant over Jane's shoulder and took the conversation. That, I believe, is mine, she remarked, and putting it in her apron pocket, she led the way home through the park. Michael broke off a spray of green buds as he went. He examined them carefully. They seem quite real now, he said. Perhaps they always were, said Jane. And a mocking voice came fluting from the ash tree. Cuckoo, cuckoo, cuckoo. And that, my friends, is the end of our story for today. Thank you so much for joining me on Soft Stories. We are rapidly approaching the end of this book, too. I hope you have been having fun with these adventures of the Banks children, just as I have. I look forward to rounding out this book next week. I hope you'll join me. But until next we meet, I must wish you all the best.